There is a human population whose genetic founding event is recorded in the colonial archives of the 1460s, not reconstructed from statistical models, not inferred from ancient DNA extracted from buried bones, not estimated from mutation rate calculations that reach backward through centuries of uncertainty. In Portuguese colonial settlement records, dated, archived, readable. Cape Verde was uninhabited when the Portuguese arrived. The people who produced the Cape Verdean genome came on documented ships from documented places in a documented decade. The founding event did not happen in a prehistory that science must piece together. It began in the 1460s and somebody wrote it down. None of that is where the story starts. The story starts with what uninhabited actually means in population genetics, because that single condition is what makes Cape Verde unlike anything else in the Atlantic world. Uninhabited means no prior genetic signal, no indigenous baseline to build from, no ancestral population that any of the founding groups would mix with. Every other population in the Atlantic world, every African American community, every Afro-Brazilian community, every Caribbean Creole population, formed through the interaction of people who were already genetically shaped by thousands of years of their own specific history. Cape Verde started from scratch. Known founding conditions, documented founding populations, 5 centuries of data attached to a known starting point. It is as close to a controlled experiment as human population genetics ever gets. And one of the founding populations is the part that most accounts of this story pass over quickly, because understanding it requires knowing what was happening in Portugal in the 1460s. The Portuguese Inquisition formally began in 1536, but the persecution of conversos, Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity under threat in 1497, began before that and intensified throughout the early decades of settlement. For conversos facing surveillance, property seizure, and the specific risk that conversion would not be accepted as permanent protection, the uninhabited islands of Cape Verde offered something the Portuguese mainland could not provide: distance, administrative thinness, the practical difficulty of Inquisition reach across open water. Cape Verde attracted a disproportionate number of converso families precisely because it was the farthest available edge of the Portuguese world. The part that stayed with me is how directly readable this is. The genetic signal of Sephardic Jewish ancestry is not inferred from statistical patterns in modern Cape Verdean DNA. It is traceable in specific communities on specific islands against specific genealogical records. The island of Brava shows the highest concentration. Genealogical research and genetic analysis both point toward a concentrated converso founding population there. Certain Cape Verdean surnames that persist today are unmistakably of Portuguese Jewish origin, traceable through the naming conventions that Sephardic families carried into their forced conversions. The Inquisition was supposed to erase them. Instead, it sent them to uninhabited Atlantic islands where they built the first Creole civilization in the modern world. The second founding population that built the connection between the Portuguese settlers and West Africa is the one called the Lançados, Portuguese men, many of them conversos, who went further than Cape Verde. They crossed to the West African mainland. They settled among the Senegambian coastal communities. They learned Mandinka and Wolof and Balanta. They married African women and had mixed families and eventually brought those families back to the islands. The word lançado comes from the Portuguese verb meaning to throw. Thrown into Africa, beyond whatever boundary the colonial administrative system was still trying to define. The Lançados are the mechanism through which Crioulo developed. Crioulo, Cape Verdean Creole, is one of the oldest continuously spoken Creole languages in existence. It dates to the 1460s. It developed specifically from the context situation the Lançados created, Portuguese-derived vocabulary organized by grammatical structures drawn from Mandinka and Wolof and Balanta on islands where no prior language had any historical claim to the territory. The language is not a degraded Portuguese. It has complete grammar. It has diverged into island variants across 5 centuries, the same way the island genomes diverged. The Santiago Crioulo and the Barlavento Crioulo of the northern islands are related but measurably different. The language variation map and the genome variation map are the same map. Both started diverging from the same founding point in the 1460s and have been separating along the same island boundaries ever since. The part of this story that stopped me when I first traced the slave trade component was not the scale of it. It was the timing. Before the Caribbean plantation system existed, before the American South existed, before any of the Atlantic colonial labor infrastructure that most people associate with the transatlantic slave trade had been built. The slave trade stopped in Cape Verde first. From approximately the 1470s onward, enslaved people from the Senegambian coast were brought to the islands as a transit and preparation point. The islands were used to train enslaved people in Portuguese language, Catholic practice, and European customs before redistribution into the broader Atlantic system. Cape Verde was the first point of Atlantic cultural contact for people taken from West Africa, and this timing is visible in the DNA. The enslaved people who arrived in Cape Verde came from the Senegambian coast during the early period of the trade, before the routes diversified and shifted toward the Gulf of Guinea and Central Africa that built the American and Caribbean plantation economies. The African ancestry in Cape Verdean DNA preserves a snapshot of West African ethnic diversity from this early Senegambian moment that has been diluted or replaced in virtually every other Atlantic diaspora community. Wolof and Mandinka ancestry is prominent. Fulani ancestry appears at elevated frequencies, unusual in Atlantic diaspora communities and reflecting the specific pastoral Sahel populations that the early Senegambian trade included. Balanta ancestry is traceable. These are not the dominant ancestry profiles of the Gulf of Guinea trade that shaped African American, Afro-Brazilian, and Afro-Caribbean genetic profiles. They are the ancestry profiles of an earlier, more geographically specific moment, preserved in Cape Verde because the population was built at that moment and then isolated from the trade's subsequent evolution. A person of Cape Verdean descent taking a commercial DNA test today will receive African ancestry classifications calibrated to Atlantic route reference panels. The test will point accurately toward West Africa, but imprecisely toward which specific ethnic groups, because the early Senegambian composition of Cape Verdean ancestry is not adequately represented in panels built from the later Gulf of Guinea-dominated trade. The genome knows more than the test currently reflects. Earlier than almost anyone outside the Cape Verdean diaspora and specialized linguistics communities understands, this distinction had already been visible in the language. Crioulu's specific West African grammatical influences traced to Mandinka and Wolof, rather than to the Bantu-speaking communities of the Gulf of Guinea and Central Africa. The language said which part of Africa before the genetic test did. The detail I found hardest to situate is not between islands. It is within one. The genetic divide does not just separate the archipelago from the world, it separates the islands from each other. The Badiu, the people of Santiago, include descendants of enslaved Africans who historically maintained deep West African cultural practices and higher African ancestry proportions, especially in the island's interior highlands. The Sampa Judy, the term for Cape Verdeans from the other islands, particularly the northern Barlavento group, developed more heavily mixed ancestry, more Portuguese culturally integrated communities over centuries of different colonial maritime exposure. Modern genetic studies show that the Badiu of Santiago carry measurably higher African ancestry proportions than the Sampa Judy communities of the northern islands. The most isolated communities preserved the most distinct genetic and cultural identity. Cape Verde makes this mechanism visible at a scale no other Atlantic community can match, because the founding event is documented and the island boundaries create natural experimental conditions that open continental geographies cannot replicate. The same mechanism operates across all 10 islands at a larger scale. Santiago has the highest African ancestry. São Vicente was settled later and shows higher European ancestry. Brava carries the highest Sephardic Jewish signal, consistent with its Converso founding history. Fogo shows a distinct founder effect from a small and specific founding group, descendants more homogeneous than islands with larger and more diverse founding populations. Santo Antão shows a West African ethnic composition that differs from the southern islands in ways reflecting different sourcing within the early Senegambian trade. 10 islands, 1 founding event, 5 centuries of separate island development producing measurable genetic divergence from a known starting point. No other Atlantic archipelago provides this comparison attached to a documented founding event. It is the most legible founding experiment in Atlantic genetics. The Diaspora extended the experiment into a new geography in the 19th century. The Cape Verdean community in New Bedford, Brockton, and Providence arrived predominantly on American whaling vessels. New Bedford was the whaling capital of the world. Cape Verdean men were recruited as crew at the islands on outbound voyages and eventually settled in New England in numbers that made this one of the oldest African-descended communities in the region, predating most African American northward migration by decades. Their genealogical records connecting New England families to specific Cape Verdean islands of origin are among the most complete Atlantic diaspora documentation chains in existence. A DNA result showing Cape Verdean ancestry in a Massachusetts family is traceable through the whaling ship manifests, through island church records, through colonial shipping documents, to the 1460s founding event. The chain has no missing links. It runs from a living person all the way back to the genetic birthday. 5 centuries of island isolation produce a genome that commercial DNA tests were not built to read precisely. If your results came back with West African ancestry that points somewhere, your family history cannot follow. If the percentages do not match the story you were given, the 1460s are almost certainly where the gap opens. The founding manifests are in the archive. The island church records are there. The chain from a living person to the ships that started this population is unbroken, and it is 560 years long. Most people who carry this ancestry do not know they carry it. Send this to one of them. Subscribe. I have not reached the end of what this founding event still contains. Thanks for watching.